The crowd had gathered by the Arkansas River that spring morning, as if humiliation itself was worth the price of admission, their boots sinking in the soft mud while jeers rose louder than the water rushing past. And at the center of it all, a father dragged his own daughter forward, her pale arms crossing desperately over her bare chest as he shouted, "Take her! She ain't worth more than a crust!" and shoved her into the shallows where the icy current bit at her ankles. She stumbled, trembling not from the cold, but from the shame of being stripped and offered like cattle. Her hair clinging wet to her face as men laughed and women whispered sharp cruelties, the whole town treating her nakedness as a spectacle rather than a crime. And I, Elias Redfeather, your storyteller, tell you that this was the year 1872, when men claimed to be civilized but still sold blood for coin. Among the onlookers stood a cowboy, unlike the rest, Daniel Crow, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples, a hat pulled low as if to hide from the world, 40 years old and still untouched by a woman's hand, not because of disdain, but because solitude had carved him hollow. The long winters and endless chores of a mountain homestead, leaving no room for softness or company. And as he watched the girl's father call for bids, shouting numbers as if life could be measured like bushels of corn. Daniel's jaw set hard, because he knew the cruelty of loneliness, and he saw it doubled now in her eyes. The wagon standing by the road shivered as the wind caught a folded wool blanket hanging from its rail, knocking it loose so it tumbled into the mud, and while the crowd ignored it, Daniel moved, each step slow and deliberate, boots sinking deep as if marking judgment into the earth itself. And when he lifted the blanket, his scarred hands shook not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Gasps rippled through the assembly as he strode into the water, the sun flashing off the wet leather of his coat, and with a gentleness no one expected from such a weathered man, he draped the blanket around her trembling shoulders, shielding her bare skin from the gaping stares, his eyes steady on hers while the river carried away the last shred of her father's control. Silence spread like wildfire through the mob as Daniel's voice cut through, low and final. "She's mine. She's my wife now." Words that stunned even the jeering mouths into stillness. For everyone knew Daniel Crow spoke little, and never without meaning, and the girl, Mara, looked up with tears glistening, but with something more, something like a fragile flame of hope, where a moment before there had been only despair. And though her father snarled, face twisted red with rage at the loss of his bargain, the townsfolk shifted uneasily, some muttering, some sneering, others staring at Daniel as if he had declared war on the very order of things, because to claim a woman stripped and sold was to defy not just a cruel father, but the gossip and judgment of an entire community. And as Daniel guided Mara toward the riverbank, the blanket clutched tight in her fists, everyone seemed to wait for what would happen next, for no man challenged the market of shame and walked away untouched. And so the first chapter of their story closed not on safety, but on a single question that lingered heavier than the mountain winds. Would the world let him keep what he had just claimed? Or would this act of defiance unleash a storm fiercer than any blizzard he had faced alone? The silence after Daniel's words did not last long, for shame loves company, and cruelty is quick to find its tongue. And soon the crowd roared back to life with louder jeers than before, men slapping their thighs as if it were a tavern joke, women clutching shawls tighter while spitting words like venom. "A wife? He calls that girl his wife?" And 40 years without a woman, no wonder he'd stoop so low, their laughter echoing off the riverbank like a whip cracking in every direction, and Mara shrank further beneath the blanket, as if she could bury herself inside its wool. But Daniel kept his hand firm on her shoulder, guiding her through the shallows toward dry ground with the same deliberate patience he used to bring a frightened colt from wildness into calm, while her father staggered after them, face purple with rage, shouting, "You got no right, Crow. She ain't yours unless she's paid for, and I'll not see you steal from me." His boots splashing mud as he tried to push between them, and the crowd surged forward, hungry for conflict, circling them the way coyotes circle wounded prey, some calling for Daniel to put Silver down, others demanding Mara be stripped again to prove she was no prize. And I, Elias Redfeather, tell you the ugliness of men revealed itself raw that day, uglier than the river's mud, because they hated not just the girl's shame, but the sight of a man refusing to let it continue. Daniel turned his scarred face to the mob and said with a voice like a storm-breaking timber, "I've worked 40 years and never touched a woman, never claimed a family, but I claim her now before God and men." And though he had not raised his rifle or even his fists, the strength in his voice pressed the nearest men backward. Yet her father lunged again, spit flying as he yelled, "You're a fool, Crow, a desperate fool, and she'll run from you like all the others, just like her mother ran from me." Words that cut deeper than any knife, revealing not just his greed, but his bitterness that the world had seen through him. And Mara flinched as if struck, whispering, "It's true, my mother ran," her voice small and raw, and for the first time Daniel understood this cruelty wasn't born today, but bred for years. The girl raised under a man who treated family as chattel, and something inside Daniel shifted from pity to iron resolve. He drew Mara closer, the blanket sliding further over her bare legs, and with a tone that left no room for laughter, he said, "She stays with me." And though stones of mockery still flew from the crowd's mouths, there was a hush beneath it, the kind of hush that comes before fists fly or guns are drawn, and the question hung in the air like the heavy clouds of a summer storm. Would the town step aside and let him walk away? Or would they test just how far a lonely cowboy at 40 was willing to go to protect the only woman he had ever dared to touch? Her father wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, eyes glittering like a man who smelled coin rather than blood, and he barked above the jeers, "Fine then, Crow. If you want her so bad, let's call it what it is. Business plain and fair. Put down your money, every cent you've got, and she's yours proper." His voice laced with the same oily tone traders used when pawning off half-broken mules, and the crowd leaned in closer, eager to see whether the grizzled cowboy would pay or fight, their hunger no longer for spectacle alone, but for profit wrung from misery. And Mara stiffened beneath the blanket as though the words themselves had branded her, whispering, "I'm not cattle," her face half hidden, but her eyes blazing with a wounded pride that even nakedness could not strip away. And Daniel felt that fire rise in him too. For all his years of solitude, he had never been tested so publicly. Yet something about this moment made him stand taller, his rough boots planted in the mud like roots of oak. "I'll not bargain for flesh," he said, his voice carrying like thunder across the bank. "She's my wife now, not my purchase." And a murmur went through the crowd. For though they had come to laugh, they were hearing the language of covenant, and such words carried weight even among men who mocked decency. And I, Elias Redfeather, must tell you it was here the tale bent toward destiny, for the insult of coin had been refused. And when a man refuses the coin, only blood or honor remains to settle the matter. Her father's face soured, jaw tight. "You're too old to be noble, Crow. 40 years without a woman and now you play the saint?" he sneered, drawing a rust-flecked knife from his belt and holding it low, the kind of blade more used to gutting fish than fighting men. But still enough to spill shame onto the dirt. And the crowd gasped, a ripple of anticipation surging like fire through dry grass, some shouting for him to stand down, others egging him forward, and Mara clutched the blanket closer, her lips trembling. "Please don't." But Daniel only stepped before her, broad shoulders blocking the knife, his voice calm but ringing like a church bell. "Then strike me if you must, but you'll never touch her again." And the words hit harder than any bullet because they were not boast but vow, born of a man who had carried loneliness as heavy as any saddle pack. And suddenly her father faltered. The knife wavering in his grip as if his own shame had found him at last. Yet instead of dropping it, he spat in the mud and snarled, "If you won't pay me, Crow, then you'd best be ready to prove your claim, because this town won't honor vows without a price." And with those words he turned back to the crowd, raising his arms like a showman, shouting, "Who here says a vow without silver is worth less than spit?" And the voices rose in ugly chorus, some demanding payment, others daring Daniel to fight for what he had claimed. And in that roaring storm of ridicule, the lonely cowboy at 40 stood unmoving, Mara trembling behind him. And the question tightened like a noose around them both. Would he find a way to buy her freedom without silver, or would he be forced to stake his life on a vow that could not be measured in coin? The riverbank became a stage, the mob its cruel audience, and Mara its trembling centerpiece, clutching the wool blanket as if it were armor, her eyes darting between the knife in her father's hand and the unyielding stance of the cowboy who shielded her. And it was then that one of the town elders, Amos Pike, a merchant with a crooked hat and sharper tongue, stepped forward, puffing out his chest as if he owned the dirt beneath their boots, his voice cutting through the din. "This won't do. Not in our town, not on this river," he declared. "A man can't claim a wife without witness, without trial. Not when her own blood contests it." And the people murmured agreement, their hunger for entertainment shifting into the solemnity of judgment. And Elias Redfeather, your teller of this tale, must confess I saw then how the frontier wrapped its law around pride and coin, not justice. Yet it was justice Daniel Crow carried in his voice when he said, "I'll face your trial, Amos, but make no mistake. She's mine already in vow, and no man here nor silver nor paper can strip that away." His words steady, heavy as the mountains themselves. The elder nodded, lips curling with sly satisfaction. For he knew the crowd would keep him honest while also feeding their thirst for spectacle. "Then let it be settled here," Amos barked. "Before all eyes, the cowboy must prove his right to her by strength or by sacrifice. Either he pays her father in coin, or he faces a test of manhood this town will deem fit." Gasps rippled through the onlookers, the excitement returning like fire-stoked, and Mara shook her head, whispering, Please don't let them drag you into this." But Daniel's hand squeezed hers beneath the blanket, his voice low and calm. "A man who's waited 40 years can wait no longer. This test is mine." And in that moment, something in her gaze shifted from fear to belief, as if she had glimpsed not just a savior, but a partner who would not bend. And the crowd cheered the decision, stamping boots and shouting challenges. "Make him wrestle her father? No, let him walk barefoot on hot coals. Bring the rope, string him and see if he can stand." Each idea crueler than the last. But finally Amos raised his hand for silence, his eyes gleaming as he pronounced, "Let it be the stone lift. Here and now, whoever raises the river stone above his head proves his claim." And the crowd roared approval, for they all knew the stone, a boulder worn smooth by decades of water, resting near the shallows where boys dared each other in summer, a test that had broken backs and pride alike. Mara gasped, "It's impossible." But Daniel only answered, "Not impossible, just never yet done." And together they walked toward the water's edge, where the massive stone lay half buried in silt, the mob pressing close, her father grinning with smug certainty, and Amos declaring, if he fails, the girl returns to her blood and her shame. If he succeeds, she is his wife in the eyes of all. And so it was set, the blanket tight around Mara's shoulders, the jeers of the town a storm around them, and Daniel Crow, the lonely cowboy at 40, bent his scarred hands toward the impossible stone that now stood as the only measure between his vow and her freedom. The crowd surged to the river's edge, boots slipping in mud, as men and women jostled for the best view, their breath hanging white in the cold air, their jeers rising like crows startled from the pines, and in the middle of that human storm, Daniel Crow stood before the river stone, its surface slick and ancient, larger than a man's torso, settled deep into the earth as if it had rooted there forever. And beside him, Mara clutched the blanket so tightly her knuckles whitened, her whispered plea nearly lost in the din. "Don't do this for me, you'll break yourself." But Daniel only glanced at her. The faintest curve of a smile cutting through the grime of his weathered face, and he said, "I've been broken before, but not for the right reason." Words that silenced even her trembling for a breath. Amos Pike raised his hand like a self-appointed judge, his voice booming across the bank. "By the weight of this stone shall the truth be proven. Lift it above your head, Crow, and she's yours before God and men. Fail, and she returns to her kin." And her father's smirk widened, his knife still hanging loose in his hand, as though certain the stone would do his work for him, while the people shouted wagers, some backing the old cowboy's pride. Others certain he would collapse in disgrace. And I, Elias Redfeather, tell you, it was in that moment I knew we were not just watching a man's strength, but the measure of his years, his loneliness, his hunger for a life not yet lived. Daniel crouched, his scarred hands digging into the frozen mud around the stone, his breath steady, his face a mask of focus as he found purchase beneath its curved edge, and then with a groan he began to pull, the veins in his arms rising like cords, his shoulders knotting under the strain, the crowd's laughter turning to gasps as the stone shuddered in its bed, lifting an inch, then sinking back with a thud that shook the ground, and men howled, "Too heavy! He'll split his spine!" But Daniel spat into the dirt and squared his stance again, saying loud enough for all to hear, 40 years without a wife, without a home. This is nothing compared to that weight." And again he heaved, the stone rising higher, his boots slipping in mud, the tendons in his neck standing out like ropes. Mara crying softly, torn between pride and fear, the blanket slipping from her shoulders to reveal the bruises of her father's grip. And when Daniel saw those marks, rage flooded through him like fire in dry grass, and with a roar that echoed against the cliffs, he surged upward, hoisting the river stone chest high, his body trembling under its impossible burden, and the crowd went wild, half in disbelief, half in awe. But Amos shouted, "Above the head! The vow demands above the head!" And Daniel staggered, nearly buckling, yet with every ounce left in his battered frame, he thrust the stone higher, arms locked, holding it for the space of 3 heartbeats before dropping it back to earth with a thunderous crash that sent mud and water spraying. For a moment there was silence, absolute and stunned. Then the mob erupted, some shouting, "He did it!" others crying trickery, her father cursing and shoving forward to snatch Mara back. But Daniel stepped between them again, chest heaving, voice raw but steady. "You saw it, every one of you. The mountain stone lifted, her freedom proven, my vow sealed." And the question now rippled through the stunned crowd like a tremor. Would the town accept the impossible act they had just witnessed, or would greed and pride still try to strip him of the woman he had claimed with sweat and blood? The silence that followed Daniel's roar and the crash of the river stone was thick enough to choke a man. Every breath on the bank caught as if time itself had frozen. And then the storm broke, half the crowd shouting in disbelief, the other half cheering as if they had seen a miracle, boots stomping and fists pumping the cold air, their voices colliding like clashing steel. "He lifted it! We all saw!" cried one, while another spat back. "No man could do it clean, he cheated the trial." And Mara pressed the blanket closer, her trembling easing as her eyes burned with new pride, whispering, "You did it." Her words meant for Daniel alone, though the crowd raged all around them. Her father's face twisted purple with fury, his knife flashing in his grip as he barked over the uproar. "You fools, you think a stone makes a husband? A blanket makes a bride? She's mine, bought and raised, and no gray-haired drifter will take her unless he pays." His voice cracking with greed and the stink of desperation. And Amos Pike, eager to keep the mob's fire stoked, raised his hands. The test was met, aye, but the question remains. Does a vow stand stronger than blood, or does blood still demand its due? And the crowd roared anew, split down the middle, some calling for justice, others for coin, the chaos pressing tighter like wolves circling a kill, their hunger no longer for truth but for spectacle stretched further. Daniel stood unmoving, chest heaving, sweat and mud streaking his weathered face, his hand steady on Mara's shoulder as he answered, "Blood that sells its own has no claim, no right to speak of kin, only of chains, and I'll not let chains bind her again." His words cutting sharper than any blade, and though many cheered, others hissed, spitting into the dirt, unwilling to yield their craving for a fight. Mara's father sneered, stepping closer with his knife low. "Then let's see if you'll bleed for your noble words, Crow!" But before he could lunge, a new voice cut the air, an old woman with silver hair and eyes hard as flint, rising from the back of the mob. "Enough!" she cried, her cane slamming into the earth. "I saw the stone lifted higher than any man has ever done, and I say the vow is sealed," her words slicing through the noise with the authority of decades. For a breath the mob faltered, some shuffling under her gaze, others muttering defiance. And I, Elias Redfeather, tell you, there are always such moments when the mob could turn toward honor or blood. But the choice is never clear until the wind blows the right way. Daniel turned his scarred face to the people, raising his voice one last time. "I've nothing but these hands and this vow, and you saw both today. If you deny it, you deny your own eyes, your own souls, and God himself." His words striking like thunder on the mountain, and as the murmurs swelled, the division sharpened, half the town swaying toward reverence, the other half clenching fists and knives, and in that jagged split of voices the air grew heavier, for all knew a reckoning was about to break. Either the mob would honor what had been witnessed, or the riverbank would soon run red with the price of defiance. The old woman's cane still quivered in the mud where she had struck it, her voice echoing like a church bell fading. But the hush she had bought could not last, for greed gnawed sharper than honor, and Mara's father lunged forward, the rust-bitten knife flashing low, his snarl raw with hate. "You won't shame me in front of my town, Crow. You'll bleed before you take what's mine." And the mob surged like a tide, half gasping in shock, half cheering for blood, their boots pounding the riverbank as if eager to shake the earth loose, and Mara screamed, clutching the blanket higher as though wool alone could hold back steel. But Daniel moved with the calm of a man who had stared too long at his own loneliness to fear another's rage, his hand catching her father's wrist mid-strike. The two men locked in a deadly stillness, muscles straining, mud sucking at their boots, eyes locked with years of bitterness and solitude burning between them. For an instant the mob fell silent, watching the test they had demanded shift from spectacle to survival. And I, Elias Redfeather, tell you, this was no mere fight of men, but a clash between the old way, blood turned to barter, family broken for silver, and the new, where vow and witness might rise above greed. With a twist, Daniel wrenched the knife free, sending it skittering across the stones into the river, and the crowd howled, some in fury, others in awe, as her father staggered back, clutching his wrist, spitting curses that rang more pitiful than threatening now. "She's still mine! Stone or vow, she's mine!" he cried. But the words carried no strength, only desperation, and Mara, trembling but resolute, stepped forward from behind Daniel, her voice breaking yet clear. "No, I am not yours. Not now. Not ever again. The blanket slipping from one shoulder to reveal the bruises her father's grip had left, proof enough of his claim's cruelty. The mob murmured, their frenzy faltering as shame seeped among them, some turning their faces, others muttering uneasily, and Amos Pike, hungry to keep control, shouted, "The trial isn't finished. Stone or no stone, a vow must be defended." And from the press of the crowd, another figure shoved forward, a broad-shouldered ranch hand with a scar over his brow, eager for violence, growling, "If he calls her wife, let him prove it with his fists," his challenge sparking new fire among those who craved spectacle. Daniel bent, picked the knife from the mud, and tossed it into the river where it vanished with a hiss, his voice low but thunderous. "I'll not kill a man for sport, but I'll fight for her honor, here, now," his stance wide, his fists curling like iron, and the mob roared its approval, the circle tightening as Mara's father retreated into the throng, his place taken by this new challenger, and the riverbank became not just a place of shame, but an arena. The outcome ready to carve into memory whether the vow of a 40-year-old cowboy meant more than blood, coin, or cruelty. The mob widened its circle at the river's edge, boots grinding the mud into slick ruts, eyes gleaming with the thrill of violence promised, and in the center, Daniel Crow stood steady as a fence post, shoulders broad, fists curling with the weight of 40 years of solitude pressed into calloused knuckles, while across from him the ranch hand rolled his sleeves, spit in the dirt, and grinned with the cruel delight of a man who enjoyed breaking bones for the sound it made. And Mara clutched the slipping blanket at her chest, whispering, "Don't," though she knew it was too late, for the town had already crowned this moment its trial by blood. The ranch hand lunged first, swinging wild, his punch whistling past Daniel's jaw, and the mob shrieked with approval, but Daniel did not flinch. He had lived too long with silence to be rattled by noise, and with a sharp pivot, he drove his fist into the man's ribs, a dull thud that sent the challenger reeling back, clutching his side, yet grinning wider. "Not bad, old man, but you've got 40 winters slowing those arms," he taunted, circling again. Daniel said nothing, his breath steady, his eyes never leaving the man's, for words were wasted where vows already stood. The next clash came harder, mud spraying as they grappled, fists thudding, one strike catching Daniel across the cheek, blood blooming from his split lip, and the mob roared, some chanting for Crow, others baying for his fall, the chaos feeding itself until even the pines above seemed to lean closer. I, Elias Redfeather, who tells you this tale, saw in that moment the truth of trials. They are not just for men to prove strength, but for towns to prove what they will honor, whether cruelty or justice. Daniel staggered under another blow, knees dipping as the ranch hand raised his fist for a finishing strike, and Mara cried out, "Daniel!" her voice breaking like a bell. And something in it snapped the years of weariness from him, for in her cry was not fear alone, but belief, the first true belief he had ever been given. And with a roar he surged upright, catching the ranch hand's wrist mid-swing, twisting until bone cracked, the man howling as his knees buckled, and then Daniel drove his fist into the man's chest with the weight of all his years, sending him sprawling into the mud, gasping for air. The mob gasped as one, the circle trembling on the edge of riot or reverence, until Amos Pike's voice rang sharp. "Enough! The trial is met. The cowboy stands, the challenger falls," his words grudging yet binding, for even greed cannot always choke truth when witnessed by so many eyes. Daniel wiped blood from his mouth, straightening, chest heaving but unbroken, and turned not to the crowd, but to Mara, saying loud enough for all to hear, "She's my wife now, not because I fought for her, but because she chose to stay behind me when she could have fled." And his words struck deeper than fists, silencing the jeers into uneasy quiet. Yet even in that hush, Mara's father hissed from the edge of the throng. "A fight don't bind her to you. Blood still calls her mine." And the mob, restless and divided, stirred again, torn between the vow they had seen proven in stone and blood, and the greed of a father unwilling to release his claim. The riverbank still throbbed with the echoes of fists and jeers. The ranch hand sprawled in the mud, groaning, while Daniel stood bloodied but unbowed, Mara clutching her blanket like a tattered shield, her eyes locked not on the crowd, but on him, the first man who had ever stood between her and her father's cruelty. And it was then the old man spat into the dirt and shoved forward once more, rage carving deep lines across his face as he bellowed, "You think a lifted stone and a brawl make her yours? She's mine, by birth, by right, by years I fed her when no one else would." His voice ragged, desperate, cutting through the uneasy quiet. And some in the crowd shifted, uncertain again, torn between what they had witnessed and the poison of blood's claim. In his hand he raised not the knife, lost now to the river, but a torn scrap of paper, a crumpled marriage contract scrawled with ink, the kind brokers carried to trade daughters like goods, and he waved it high for all to see. Signed and sealed, her fate written in Denver, promised to the next man with coin. I'll sell her yet, Crow, and no stone nor fist will change it. His words a dagger meant for the crowd's conscience more than Daniel's heart. And I, Elias Redfeather, who carries this tale, swear the hush that followed was heavier than any storm, for even those who jeered faltered at the sight of paper binding flesh. Mara's lips parted, her voice trembling but clear. "That paper was never mine. It was yours, and I will not live bound to ink made by greed," her defiance cutting sharper than her father's shout. Yet the mob murmured, some nodding with him, others shaking their heads, the division splitting deeper. Daniel stepped forward, his broad frame a wall between her and the man who called himself father. And in a voice low but thunderous he declared, "You raised her only to sell her, starved her of love and called it bread, chained her with shame and called it care. You're no father, only a jailer who's lost his keys." The crowd gasped, for truth spoken plain carries more power than fists or coin, and yet her father's face twisted darker, his eyes wild. "Then if I can't sell her, I'll damn her! I'll drag her naked through this town till she remembers who owns her blood!" He lunged, not with steel, but with clawed hands outstretched toward Mara, and she screamed, stumbling back as the blanket slipped to the mud. But before he could clutch her, Daniel seized him, rough hands gripping the old man's collar, lifting him as easily as kindling. His voice cracking like a rifle shot. "You'll never touch her again, not while I draw breath." The mob surged, some crying for blood, others for peace, the tension a whip pulled taut, ready to snap, and in that boiling storm one truth grew clear. Either the town would break with the old man's greed, or break Daniel Crow himself, and the next breath would decide which way the river carried their fate. The river roared in the silence, a sound louder than the mob itself, as Daniel Crow held the old man by the collar, his boots dangling inches above the mud, the paper contract crumpled in his fist, a symbol of greed dissolving under the weight of truth. And for a heartbeat all eyes fixed on the sight. One man who had waited 40 years for love, one girl stripped of everything but a blanket, and one father who had mistaken blood for ownership. "Let him down," some cried. "Teach him a lesson," shouted others. The crowd split by hunger for violence and the ache for justice. And I, Elias Redfeather, who tells you this tale, swear that moment bent the whole town's soul, for whichever way they leaned would mark them for years. Daniel's voice thundered above the river's rush, raw and certain. "This man is no father. He sold his own child for silver, bound her name to paper like she was cattle, and stripped her bare to hide his shame. But I tell you before God and this town, she is no man's property. She is my wife, not because I bought her, but because I vowed it with my hands, with my blood, with the stone itself, and because she chose me in her heart." His words struck like hammers, and Mara, trembling, stepped forward, the blanket slipping but her voice clear. "Yes, I choose him," she cried. "Not you, not ever you again." And the tears on her cheeks caught the light like glass, a vow stronger than ink or blood. The mob gasped, then hushed, for there is power when a woman speaks truth against chains, and Daniel set the old man down, not gently but not cruelly, shoving him back into the mud, where the paper split apart, washed away by the river's edge, the last mark of his false claim dissolving in the current. Some spat at the old man, others turned their backs, and Amos Pike, who had fanned the fire all along, raised his cane and declared, "The vow is sealed, the town has witnessed, the stone has spoken, and the girl has chosen. She is wife to the cowboy now, and none may contest it." His words grudging, yet binding, for the mob accepted them with weary nods, their hunger spent, their shame revealed. Mara fell against Daniel, her arms clutching his bloodied shirt, whispering through sobs, "You saved me when I had nothing left." And he bent low, pressing his forehead to hers, his breath ragged. "No, you saved me. 40 years alone ended here, by this river." The people, one by one, drifted back to their homes, their jeers fading, their silence heavier than any verdict, leaving only the three at the riverbank, one broken, one reborn, and one who had never belonged to greed. Daniel draped the blanket back over Mara's shoulders, lifting her in his arms as if to carry her from shame itself, and together they walked toward the cabin he had built with his own hands, their silhouettes etched against the reddening sky. Behind them, her father sat in the mud, powerless, the river swallowing the last fragments of his paper, while ahead lay the first true home either of them had ever known. And so it was, in that year, before the witness of stone, river, and crowd, that the lonely cowboy at 40 found not only a wife, but the life he had long thought the mountain had stolen from him, a vow made unbreakable by choice, by suffering, and by love that no coin could measure. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had stood by the river, would you have honored his vow or demanded silver? Tell us in the comments.